let me just ask you a couple of questions, and I want to make sure I draw all of you in here, because there's a lot of people here with a lot of experience, knowledge. We have, as you said, members of the 9 companies that make up the coalition here as well, who may have some ideas or additional points they want to raise as well. So I want to make sure we have a conversation. We can run all the way to 11 o'clock if we can keep the conversation going that long, which I would think we will be able to do. But can you just say something more of where you finished there, first of all, just on the corporate side, because this is a lessons learned. And I think you talked something about scale. And the kind of scale of the systems that they offer, offices, financial infrastructure, supply chains, which of course mean that each multinational company has a massive knock-on effect and a kind of tail effect. But could you say something as well also about the rule making? You know, big multinationals tend to operate nowadays increasingly with standards, whether it's on transparency, whether it's on environmental sustainability, and I think increasingly, on the gender dimension. I mean, I don't know if it's got to the same scale as the commitments to sustainability yet, or to environment. Should they? Does it? And how do you combine these big multinational scale rules with the need for local delivery, especially if you're looking at the kind of parts of the world you talked about here? Just say something about that.
Okay, I think that actually it may be good to draw from one of the Global Business Coalition, if that's okay on that. And it might be a good idea for me to first just show everybody the companies that are in the room.
Away.
So I'm going to ask you guys to stand up as I say the company.
There we go.
Okay, so Marks and Spencer, PwC, Goldman Sachs, Coca-Cola, Mondelez, who we always seem to want to say is Cadbury Kraft Nabisco, new name, yeah. ExxonMobil, Walmart, and Qualcomm. Okay, so if you can just imagine those companies, they were all chosen to be in a different industry. I picked them each in a different industry and each already having significant programs. And if you can imagine the reach of that particular group of companies, all right, because they're all in different industries, it's really huge. But the question of localization is a big one. And I think that, Charlotte, you had a nice answer for that when we were discussing it earlier today, how you deliver something that's scalable but also localized.
Do you want me to stand up? Or
stand up, then people will see you. If you don't mind, that'd be better.
Charlotte Oates, Coca-Cola.
I think we've had a lot of discussion on scaling, and I think we all want to make sure that the programs that we have locally are as relevant as possible, but we all try to set out to actually deliberately design it for scale. And it's a balancing act, because you don't want to end up with lots and lots of small pilots everywhere that don't scale. So what we do is we look at trying to deliberately partner with people who will be able to scale with us. What we don't want to do is scale a program that is going to scale very fast but then not be effective. So it's a constant balancing act. What we do is obviously work with other governments, NGOs and other businesses and try to find that sweet spot of really effective program that will provide, in our case, our program is focused on enabling women entrepreneurs right across our value chain. And our aim is to reach 5 million of them to really enable them to economic empowerment by 2020. So one of the programs I can think of is where we work in the Philippines with TESDA, the local government agency of training and education resources. And we have now, we will scale by 2020 200,000 women entrepreneurs who will either already have a business or will be setting up a business. That training has been shared in terms of the approach that we take with other markets beyond the Philippines across Asia. We have invited in governments, we've invited in other businesses and also just countries to view what's working and what isn't, and that's now starting to scale even further across other geographies, obviously making sure it stays very local and relevant for those areas. So just one small example.
And as I said in some conversation before, also I remember, I think Jenny Grieser at Walmart also made a very interesting point about how you maintain kind of local cultural approach while scaling big projects. I mean, Jenny, do you want to say something about that? If you bring the microphone down the front as well, because I thought that was a very interesting point you made earlier today.
Yeah, when we work in markets, we really like to have the people that are, in that market, who have boots on the ground, who know the ecosystem. We say kind of customize whatever the training is that we're doing, so that we can make sure not only do we have their buy-in because they're right there and they're running the program, but that they can really understand what the unique barriers that would be in a particular culture or a particular market to help us be more successful with that training.
I think many people are not aware of how long that these companies have been engaged with this, nor how broadly. And a lot of that information is in my little book here. It also includes some of the results of what they've had. Collectively, this group has 53 years of experience in women's economic empowerment. They're in 132 countries, and they have already reached 18.5 million women. So even though many of these programs have been in pilot phase during that time, and a lot of them also operate at the system level. So it's really quite a large footprint.
When you talk about systemic change, obviously you started with the rural, which is the form of economy that's been around, obviously, for thousands, if not certainly tens of thousands of years. And yet we're in a world of data and a world of technology and communication. So could you just say something about, certainly drawing on the insights from the report, the way that access to data, mobile telephony, information, and I suppose this interaction on the rural side, but it could also be applicable to other areas of business, is that changing the kinds of opportunities you think available to women today? A lot of people say digital inclusion, which is an area that you're working on, at Chatham House, my colleagues are as well, is actually becoming a bit of an obstacle. It's just, rather than becoming an opportunity, access to the data, to the mobile telephony, to the education necessary to apply it might be a hindrance. Which way round is this playing at the moment in terms of women's economic empowerment?
Digital inclusion has been a very intense interest in this area from a lot of the players, actually. There are some very specific kind of applications that occur. Many of them are still being tested out. You do run into the same kinds of things that I mentioned in the talk, where if you're going to try to do mobile money, you still run into the problem of the women have to have a national ID, right? Or for example, they don't have access to transportation to get their crops to market. So if you give them a mobile phone that has prices for their commodity on it, it really doesn't matter because they don't have any way to get there. And if their way to get there, they have to choose wherever that truck driver's going. So there's some limited, but I would say in general that I do believe that technology is going to be key to solving this problem, because you need to get past those barriers of mobility and communication that do tend to be part of this package.
And there's somebody from Qualcomm here as well on that. Do you have somebody on the mobile telephony side?
They do a lot, yes.
Yeah. Do you want to say something just about that? Because again, rare that we get somebody who's in the thick of actually trying to provide the answers on this.
So I think some of the statistics will show that there's more than 4 billion mobile phones today, actually more mobile phones than toothbrushes. So as the report says, that mobile phones are arguably the most important tool for women's equality over the past 50 years. And for Qualcomm in particular, our Wireless Reach program focuses on using mobile technology to improve people's lives in the areas of entrepreneurship, healthcare, education, public safety, and women's empowerment is a key area there. From women's entrepreneurship to access to healthcare, mobile phones can be used in a multitude of ways that just 5 years ago wasn't even possible.
And if you don't mind me, just if you keep the microphone for a second, but for a company such as yours, if you're doing the philanthropic side of your work, do you try to find a way for it to connect into that theory of change? So education, critical, digital education, do you do things like that? Is that part of what you do as a company in terms of your philanthropic work?
Absolutely. So the Wireless Reach program in particular, we have over 19 projects that are specifically focused on women's empowerment in those areas that I mentioned: healthcare, education, public safety. And not only is it focused on improving people's lives, but ultimately it ends up being good business for the company because you're expanding the access that people have to mobile technology and therefore expanding the market for the products itself.
I mean, just coming back, Linda, to you for a second and focusing on the fact that you have applied this principally to developing countries, rural areas and so on. I mean, a lot of the work you're talking about here and that the companies are involved in, that you've kind of collated this information about, are involved in affirmative action. It's a form of affirmative action, strikes me. That can create resistance. So how do you see that playing out? I mean, you've got to engage men, fathers, brothers, sons in the process. It must not seem that it's interfering in a way with social structures, with an affirmative action that is Western in its style. What's your impression of that? Is this a big problem, or in fact is that an old-fashioned view of those societies in itself, and they are looking for change, and all those fathers and brothers are actually looking for really empowered sisters and wives and mothers?
Well, I actually do think to a large extent what at least I experience in the developing world is people looking for change. However, I do think that one of the things the women of the North and the women of the South have is that you run into resistance when you try to close the gender gap. And you have to always plan for that, at least in my experience in the developing context, because the resistance can be quite dangerous. But I definitely think that resistance is part of the picture, and that's in part because while we have to tailor our programs to local contexts in order to make sure that they're effective, the problem that we're dealing with is a global problem. And actually, I would argue that the pattern of gender inequality is strong enough to see from space. It's not idiosyncratic.
And I suppose some of the concern might be zero-sum on money, and some of it might be also about loss of status. And so I presume this is, when we get into the cultural aspects here, this is going to be quite important. And that applies north and south, by the way.
In my experience, anyway, the loss of status is more of a concern often than the money, because actually, if the woman in the household starts earning some money, usually that's kind of a welcome change. So Chris from Mondelez wanted to say something. I'd like to hear from her.
Roxanne, one microphone here. Thanks.
Thank you. So in Cocoa Life, we do a lot of work in Africa and Indonesia and really remote places, and that's exactly one of the challenges that we work on with our local partners, is how do you introduce the concept of gender and women's empowerment in a culturally sensitive way, because these norms have been there for hundreds of years of how the village operates, and so we take a whole community approach to it. We don't go in and say, okay, we're now here to empower women. It's done very sensitively, and our mantra is, when you empower a woman, a whole community will thrive. And what we see in doing it in a way that, we go in and we do basically what we call needs assessment, where we talk with the village chief, we talk with the youth, we talk with men, we talk with women separately, and we kind of hear all of their voices, and then are able to have them kind of come together and talk about solutions that would address their community issues. But we make sure that women are given a voice in that dialogue, and that women are able, as Linda said in the beginning, as they develop their plans, we insist that, or we nudge, we call it facilitation. So it's not manipulation, it's not facilitation. It's it's kind of helping to guide along in a way that's relevant for that culture, that women should have a role. And actually, one of the things, now that we've been at this for a few years, that we hear from the men. I was just in Indonesia a couple months ago. Actually, the men say, I'm kind of happy that my wife's happy happier, you know, and that's kind of making me happier at home. And we have better management of our household finances. She's doing a better job, you know, knowing how to save money and help run our family farming business. So most of the men that we're hearing from see it as a win-win because they're not having to do all of the financial burden and take all of that on themselves. So there's hope that it can be done in a sensitive way.
May I offer, I think this might be a good time to talk about the question of why are these businesses doing this? Because obviously what Chris has just explained is quite an elaborate strategy. This also is in the report. I think we have 15 different possible benefits to business, and the reason we want to talk about this is in part to be trying to communicate to, at least in my travels around the world, governments and NGOs are often asking me, well, so what's in it for them? Why are they doing this? But also because the GBC for We is very keen to have other businesses join up. So they want to be able to put out there the kinds of benefits. And one of them in particular is stabilization of supplies. And this is especially relevant in agriculture. Because I was talking about the global food supply. Well, if you're a retailer selling a particular crop, or you're making a product that needs a certain food as an ingredient, all right, you're very concerned with both the stability and the quality of that supply. So that is the kind of thing. And there are some crops around the world that are potentially in danger that we all would be very sorry to see. For example, chocolate and coffee, okay? So I know I have your attention now. Other things are labor productivity, employee recruitment and retention, actually financial performance, government relations, obviously. There really are a lot of benefits to business to doing this, and it's not necessarily down to profit. It's a much broader kind of a value.
And I presume at the moment with some of the big global trends that are taking place, aging societies, climate change, just to stand still in many cases, you're going to have far more productive economies. And yet I think obviously I'd be right in saying that on this side, women tend to get the short end of the shrift, certainly on care. Care for families, care for sick, care for elderly, care for children. So that brings me a little bit to the sense, to what extent could you rely on government's ability to change the ecosystem in which women are able to be empowered? How important is it to team up as well with governments? And from what experience, again, maybe the companies can answer this as well, how much of this is partnerships where they're coming in as the business partner to communities, and how much is it them partnering with government programs to try and help communities as well? How does that triangle kind of fit, work? Does it work well, not so well?
Actually, it's, I think, fairly common for them to have these kinds of partnerships, although my perception is the more common partnership is with NGOs and other businesses, but definitely with governments as well. And I'm also aware that many governments are very keen to work with the private sector. And there's a little bit more to be done, I think, of making that an easier collaboration maybe than it has been. That has a lot to do with, at least from my viewpoint, the governments and really any public sector or not-for-profit personnel understanding kind of what business is in a bigger sense, and understanding how the things that they're doing fit into that bigger picture, which again is another reason for the report.
I don't know if any of the other companies want to come up on that partnership element with governments or not. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but yeah, sure. Holly.
Hi, Ian. So we have a partnership in Korea, which originated with the Community Care Chest of Seoul, which is an NGO, and it was focused on the aging population within Korea, which is a real problem. And oftentimes, women are the ones that are the ones that are left living longer. And so we initially started with it was kind of an Internet of Things device, which actually enabled healthcare providers to communicate with elderly people in their homes and make sure they were okay, and it was, they could push a button and they they could speak with a healthcare provider. And it was so successful that the city of Seoul ended up taking it over and rolling it out across the city. So it wasn't initially working with the government, but it was successful as a pilot, and so the government took it over. And it's interesting because now it's evolved where they're actually working with Alzheimer patients using fitness bands, basically, to be able to track the elderly in case they wander off. They're able to, their loved ones and their healthcare providers are able to understand where they are.
Fantastic. Look, I'm going to turn in a sec to get lots of other viewpoints. We've got 35 minutes and so on left to do that. I want to have a bit of a conversation. But let me just throw one maybe slightly more provocative question to you, Linda, and easier for you to answer this one. But multinational companies, you yourself said, often come nowadays with create some antibodies. You just mention the name and you'll get sometimes a public resistance. And there's a sense to which this kind of agenda, which seems so logical at one level, can be seen as part of more of the globalization, neoliberal, one standard, getting more people into a homogenous workforce that is just servicing the big beast of globalization. Do you find, are you getting knockbacks on this front? I mean, do you find this is a theme that as you've launched this project, and you're in the academic sector where sometimes these views are quite strongly held, do you find that there's resistance to this approach, getting a business-led approach to women's economic empowerment?
Absolutely, absolutely. And for me, it's a really odd place to be because I really actually do believe that making work with the private sector on this is the best benefit to women, fastest, and that's really what I'm about. It's not about making money or anything like that. All right, it's about what is the most benefit to women and how fast can it be. And so, yes, it's a contradictory position to be in, and it is sometimes uncomfortable. I do want to speak, though, to some of the criticism because I feel, because it is definitely, it's in the public press as well, it's something that is really, I think, poorly informed and often rather sloppy. Okay, so for example, just the term neoliberalism is thrown around so much now that it's just an epithet. It doesn't have any meaning. It's about like calling somebody a mouth breather. Okay, it just doesn't have anything, right? But in the beginning, what it meant was something like that it was people who thought that all problems could be solved by the market, okay, or it was people who only focused on the individual level and not on system level change. And so when people make that kind of criticism, I know that they haven't taken the trouble to learn anything about these programs, okay, because nobody in these programs that I know says this can all be done by the market. I mean, that's, as far as I'm concerned, just sheer lunacy. And I don't hear anybody saying that. All right, the other thing is that among this group and also other corporations, there's quite a lot of focus on the system level. So, for example, making international credit facilities available, training programs for banks, corporate and government procurement opportunities. They work with the International Trade Center. Huge program to identify women-owned businesses so that they can buy from them. It's definitely identification. I mean, how system level is that? So definitely, I just feel it's unfair. And I just feel it's very unrealistic. And I also, frankly, don't think there's any evidence to support that position.
Okay. Look, we've got a lot of other people here, so let's get some viewpoints in from people in general. Folks who've participated. Somebody jump in with a question or a point. Yeah, please, and just introduce yourself. There's a microphone coming. Microphone coming here. And I'll take a question there, and let me get a few viewpoints in. We go 1, 2, 3. Yep.
Thank you. Kitty Chisholm, Boardwalk Leadership. The point I'd like to reinforce is what you said about being visible from space. This is bigger than culture. It's bigger than economics. It's about people. It is a profoundly human trait, which goes across all cultures. We've done some research on the other side of the fence. We've asked the opposite question. We've asked females who have got to the top of whatever organization, public, private, government, non-government, charity, family, whatever. We said, how did you get to the top? And we left it completely open, so we didn't shape their answer. And this was across about 60 countries, ranging from extremely poor African countries, Muslim countries in Asia, rich and poor, Canada, UK, US, Scandinavia, you name it. The commonalities were mind-blowing. Women said exactly the same thing. Whether they'd been born in a mud hut, whether they were running an NGO, they said exactly the same things. Two things, they said. Somebody somewhere told me I could do it, believed in me. That was number one. And remember, this was a story they told us. We had to mind the story. The second thing was, and they gave me, or someone gave me, a chance to prove what I can do. And I think what I'm hearing from the companies that are involved in this is that is what you are doing. You are giving women the opportunity to prove what they can do. And that's what makes it sustainable. So yeah, I do believe it is seen from space because it is about what's in here. It's about us and them.
Great, thank you. Yeah, please, gentlemen there, and then we'll come to the front row. And sorry.
Hi, I'm Wade Channel from USAID. I want to follow on with that story, and I think it goes to something that was said by Mondelez. The groups in this business coalition, I would say that your combined advertising budgets are more than the lowest 10 countries' GDP in the world, and maybe much larger than that. Many of the stories that I know that are part of my perceptions of what men do and what women do were brought to me through advertising as a child and television and so on. Those are changing, but latex gloves so women don't mess up their hands while they're doing the dishes, things of that sort. They bury deeply. I think we can all think of those. I'm just curious from your ends how you see this, our women's economic empowerment agenda and imperative from that advertising side without being preachy, without being looking down. I'd be curious about what any of you might be doing in that regard right now to change the story.
Very interesting point. Just pass the microphone behind you because I meant to take gentleman first. I'm coming to the front. Yeah,
Right.
We'll do the first four and then we'll get some comments back. Yeah.
Thanks very much. My name is Arnan. I work for Canada's International Development Research Centre. Thank you very much for hosting this. Maybe the answer to my question was a little bit, and it's not just the market, but I was wondering if your emphasis is, I suppose, rightly on the constraints to women are in the business community, but there is a lot of knowledge which you've contributed to as well. Is that there's also issues on the supply side. Women, the constraints that women face to access those opportunities are far more than just the business opportunities themselves. There's the constraints in time. There are the social norms, as the lady there spoke about, and we know, including I think the research that you did with Walmart, is that when those opportunities, the market access is provided, the number of constraints that you still encounter are just numerous. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about those and what can be done to address those simultaneously.
Okay, well, last point to the front, please. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Susan J Mumford, and I'm the founder of an association. It's a private sector trade association called the Association of Women Art Dealers. Now, I've identified that I have been addressing gender disparity since I was 6 years old, apparently about the time that you start becoming conscious of gender in a social context. And essentially it's been a driving force throughout my life. Now, I'm in the small business sector. I've been an entrepreneur since 2004. I've run multiple businesses. I currently have two. One of those businesses, the Association of Women Art Dealers, is essentially representing the interests and supporting a number of micro and small businesses. And what I wonder, being here, this is the first event I have ever attended like this. I'm very, very keen to develop my own personal career in terms of equality and bias and intersectional bias. So I see all the large companies here, and I'm thinking, how many people are in the room might be from this small or even medium-sized sector? What's the representation of your work and everything you're doing with the small business sector? I'm aware of how much of the economy we do represent and how we can get involved. And I'm aware of the importance, of course, of education. So in terms of questions, I suppose the underlying one would be really the engagement of small business sector getting involved and educating them as to the benefits to their businesses and helping with economies. Thank you.
Great. Good set of opening points. Let me just take those four first. I took some notes, but you've got them all in your head by the look of things, Linda, so this is good.
Okay, sure. Let me try to start by kind of merging these first two comments. It is very much true that this is a global pattern and that when you're in the field, you hear things that you could hear in Chicago or in London, and it's amazing. And I think the statistics bear this out as well at this point. And I also think that what you're talking about in terms of confidence is one of the things that this group has identified, and I'd kind of like to give a plug for Chatham House and for the ExxonMobil Foundation here in terms of being very active in developing measures that will pick up that kind of thing, because I think they're all agreed it's important. In terms of advertising budgets, I would like to say that these are expensive programs. And this is one of the things that really kills me when people say, oh, well, it's just PR. Well, you know, you can get PR cheaper than this, okay? And it wouldn't be a good expenditure if you were doing it just for the PR. The other thing is that I totally hear you, Wade, about those commercials. You know, I grew up in the 50s, and it's still back there. But at the same time, as you know also, and many of you do, much of my field work is really out there. In terms of way off-road, way beyond the reach of media. And I am always amazed that those folks are up to their earlobes in gender stereotypes and they don't have television. So I think that's, yeah. And then to the young man behind Wade, I think that one of the things that is really interesting is the way that the whole circle of constraints, and I think Chris did a good job of kind of identifying that too, the whole circle of the constraints, the enculturation to gender roles through media, the inability to control cash, mobility constraints are enormous, the constant threat of violence, the different access to education, that yes, all of these things come together. And while we may be focusing on the economic part of this, I think everybody is very much aware that all those things are together. One of my missions in all of this has been to make people more aware of how the economics of this work. There has been quite a lot of focus during my lifetime on legal rights and human rights, and these are very important. But there is a very real extent to which you can't claim your rights unless you've got the money to leave town. Okay, there is a connection between power, autonomy, and economic viability. And I think we do all ourselves a disservice if we don't acknowledge that and start working on it. Oh.
There's one more executive.
Yeah,
but let me just hold on. Can I just ask you one little follow-up before you come to the point, very important about micro-businesses and small businesses on that legal dimension. I think it was a very important point I noticed in the report about how important privacy is for financial inclusion. In other words, you know, being able to, for women to be able to sort of keep something to themselves, even from husbands if needs be or whatever, as probably works in both ways. So, you know, is that legal? Is that cultural? I mean, to what extent do you think governments get that they're going to have to change the legal environments in many cases in order to enable change to take place?
I think a lot of the governments have gotten onto this and have changed some of the regulations as far as what is required to, for example, open a bank account. But there are still a lot of practical constraints, like I talked about, the identification and stuff. And then often on the ground you find a moral issue, which I'm just always amazed by, in which it is perfectly acceptable for the men to hold the money and not to tell the woman either what they've got or how they're spending it. But it is considered morally reprehensible for the woman to do the same thing with her own money. So there's a real challenge there. I did want to just jump on that. That SME thing is really focal, and it's one of the reasons why it's really important to this whole effort is to be able to look at this problem globally and not just in the developing countries, right? Because women SME owners have very similar issues. It's kind of like it's the window dressing that's different. The rest of it is pretty much the same. And I would also actually argue that the invisibility of women in the arts as well as in economics is one of the things you're struggling with. Yeah.
I suppose the SME side, you've got, I mean, again, through the multinationals, SMEs are the supply chains in many cases.
Absolutely.
All the distributors,
Absolutely.
all
Absolutely.
the tech providers, all the service providers, all the way
Yeah.
through. So I would say simply, if you want to catch up, you should talk to the folks here, and you'll discover that I think they expand. Right, I've got lots of hands going up now, as always happens. I'm taking, there was a couple here, front. Yeah, start there first, if I may. Yeah. I'm coming to the triangle over there. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Basma Al-Qassar. I'm from Kuwait. I founded the Women Mentor Forum to support women in the private sector, starting in Kuwait, and hopefully my vision is to expand in the GCC. So one of the goals of my organization is to conduct research on women in the private sector locally and understand how we're losing in numbers. So starting in Kuwait and then eventually, hopefully, adding to that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE, just so we understand, especially because the economic sector and the financial sector is male-dominated, and we need to show men numbers for them to understand, like, yes, we need to promote more women into leadership positions. So just to start, what are the things that we need to measure, and what are the tools? Just for me to begin this journey into doing this research and then showing the numbers, and eventually out of these numbers we can influence more men because women are already so.
Thank you. Well, I've jotted that one down. Funny you should mention measurement, because measuring came up a little in the conversation earlier. Right at the back, please, if I could first. I'll come here. Here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'm Isha Nelson from Quartz. I just wanted to touch back on the business cases you made about why it's so important to do this beyond the issue of fairness, and wondering if we could hear a little bit more from the companies that are involved in the project about some of their examples of why they've decided to go ahead with, as you say, these very expensive projects. Thanks.
Great. And Sally, yeah, please, microphone here.
Thank you very much. My name's Sandy Rees-Jones, and I work in engineering, construction and infrastructure. And we have double whammies there. I would like to pick up the reference to SMEs and also add in what I see as a very powerful influence, or a growing influence, in this country, and I think to extent other countries, which is the role of private family-owned businesses. And certainly in the construction sector, it is those businesses who are really doing things about female empowerment. They're not looking over the shoulder at their stock market price, or they might have tricky shareholders, like the granny who won't give up and doesn't actually contribute to the business, but it's more manageable. And there are some very good examples there. And I think there are also some very good examples on the role of women being visible through professional institutions. And there has been a flurry of women at the head of the civils, the mechanicals, the architects, the surveyors, the geophysicals. They all run their own businesses. So I think that there are examples there that can be used, but I wondered how much you are looking at balancing the issue of scalability, and in looking at scalability, losing the very valuable contribution by smaller enterprises who do actually make it work.
Okay, let me just take one more here, and I think we'll do one more round afterwards. So one more at the front. My colleague, sorry, no. I will get to you in a minute. Yep.
Thanks, Patricia Lewis from Chatham House. On scalability, there's a heavy emphasis in the report on digital technologies. So in looking at the digital inclusion and the number of women who participate, there's a major gender gap in developed as well as in developing countries. So part of the scalability is addressing that. And we're looking at how we might do that. So we have to work clearly with a lot of tech companies, but also governments. And someone mentioned the issue of privacy, and I would add insecurity, which are two sides of the same coin, and the trust and the trustworthiness of the internet. But I would also add in the issue of content creation and developing the internet by women, for women, because it is not that. It's an internet that has been driven by a very different approach, if you like. And I think that this is one of the problems we have with digital inclusion. I wonder if we could perhaps look at how we might address that as we go to scale.
I think there's a few points there. Do you want to address some of those, and then some of your colleagues might as well, and then I will go for another round.
Yeah, but I think I might want to point to some of these guys again, especially there was a question about kind of some of the outcomes of some of the programs, measurements. Yeah. Jenny, you have a lot to say about that. Let's hear from her.
Jenny, yeah.
Thanks. Well, I was going to talk a little bit too about address the question of shared value, because we really do look at, we're businesses, so we really do want to hopefully have our programs eventually have some business benefit for the most part. Some things are philanthropic, and we don't expect them necessarily to right away affect our business. But a lot of what we do in the programs of training women, especially women entrepreneurs, is hopefully to strengthen our supply chain, whether it's strengthening our supply chain in food, in agriculture, whether it's training women in factories to make the factories more efficient is what we're finding, or bringing women into our supplier matrices and providing capacity training around business and how to scale their business. And as far as the kind of the small to medium businesses, remember that a lot of what we do also is through our tier 1 suppliers, we ask them to be using women-owned businesses themselves. So we also at Walmart, we track what we call our tier 2 suppliers. So we have all of our major suppliers turn into us the number of spend or cost purchases that they do with other women-owned businesses. And we certainly encourage that. So perhaps if you don't have a sophistication level yet to service a big corporation, you gain experience by being a tier 2 supplier and perhaps growing your business that way. And then just one thing about the person who was talking about how do you track the number of women, perhaps, in your companies. We have one of our programs at Walmart is we ask our suppliers who, in Bentonville, Arkansas, we're probably the largest client for most, big corporations, Mondelez, Coca-Cola, P&G, all of them. And they have hundreds of people who service our accounts. And so in order to make those accounts more diverse, we ask every year for them to report the ethnic and gender makeup of their teams and at what level. So who's an administrator, who's a mid-manager, and who's a key account leader, in hopes that them knowing that a diverse team reflects our customer base and is a more productive team. And we've seen it move the needle a little. We've been doing this now for about 3 years. And we have seen an increase in the diverse and ethnic makeup of the people on the teams and at the levels that they're servicing.
And so Jenny, you're just asking them to report. You're not saying you have to hit
quotas.
this level,
Right.
otherwise you don't get the contract. No, it's kind of naming, shaming kind of thing.
Yeah, no quotas. But we also offer through the website, they can see on kind of a little grid where they stack up compared to other people. They don't get to see who those other people are, but like on a little 9-point grid, they can see okay, I'm here, and the rest of my people in my division are up here. And then we offer just kind of like links to how can they start to recruit more diverse people, or what kinds of things can they do to become a more diverse team. So just using, again, our influence, I guess you would say, with our supply base to try to bring about some of that change. But I would say you really do have to track not only the number of women, but at what level are they, and then the movement within that level.
Yeah, great. Do you want to address just the thing on the private family-owned businesses, or on the issue of digital inclusion? Those are two that are hanging out there.
Okay, yeah, well, I want to kind of draw together the engineering and the content and the tech sector and the finance one. All of these play on yet another set of stereotypes that it's really crippling, and that is that women can't do numbers. and that women can't lift heavy equipment. Right? And we need to start learning to call out that poppycock, okay? That's just crazy. And it's bad science on the numbers. It's just not true anymore. You start to see people making claims like the guy at Google that women's brains are different. Women's brains are not different. The testing performance on a national level, all the gaps have been closed. And where there are gaps, they track directly with the World Economic Forum Gender Index. So it's pretty obvious that it's not a brain thing, it's a culture thing. And so, I mean, I really think we need to get smart about dealing with that. And I would like to say two things about, because I'm not as aware about the engineering, though I think family-owned businesses is extraordinarily important. The business about the tech center and the finance, particularly in the Middle East. I think we really need to be watching all the terrible stuff that goes on in the tech sector. That is where things are moving, and to a very large degree, women are being left out by sheer bullying. And we really, again, we're better than this. And anyway, thank you for bringing it up, because I think that we talk about it in very general ways. And I would add, as far as who needs to be held responsible, is the schools, including the universities, as I think some of the problems happens there. On the finance, actually, it's really interesting. It is a male-dominated sector. It's pretty much a male-dominated sector everywhere. The outcomes are not as dissimilar as one might think. For instance, I recently did a study, and one of the statistics we cited was that in both the United States and in Lebanon, approximately 30% of the SMEs are owned by women, and they get less than 5% in both cases of the conventional business loans. So what's up with that? And but one of the problems is being able to show the banks that they need to look at this, and the problem there has to do with sex disaggregated data. There's recently been a report by Data 2X and the IFC, I think it was, and the Global Banking Alliance for Women, where they went around the central banks and the banking sector and asked how many of you are sex disaggregating your data, and basically the answer was 0. They don't think it's important. It's just like, it's just like I opened my speech with. They don't think it's important. Where that has been done, the few times it has been done, actually the women show up to be really good bank customers. Okay, so it's really important to make them visible. And there's a really good case study coming out, if I may plug myself and Goldman Sachs, coming out on a bank in Lebanon that's done just a heroic job on this stuff. But I think that it's another case of making things visible, and it's another case where governments come in. Because a lot of the reason that banks don't sex disaggregate data is because there's some kind of regulation that keeps them from doing that.
I say, in a way, people thought they were helping by not allowing the sex disaggregation. We just created the opposite thing. Right. Lots more hands going up. I think we've definitely got time for one more round. Sorry, the lady who I missed earlier. Sorry. And I'll come here. Yeah. I want to go around this side a bit. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Arza from the IFC. And I wanted to know, from your experience in working in rural areas, what is the best way to get credit to women that in areas that you do have mobility issues where there may not be transport links? How do you get them the credit, one? And then also, once you do if you are able to get them the credit, how do you get their goods into the market, whether it's the domestic market or international markets where you can't really grow the infrastructure in parallel?
Okay, some quite practical questions there, which I'm sure somebody from the group can address. Sorry, lady here in the middle of the road is fine. Stefan, yeah, you first, please. A whole cluster there. Good.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Lindsay Watson from Canuck Productions, an animation company that I founded. I'm a freelance animation producer. I also founded Animated Women UK. We represent around 1,000 women out of 5,000 in the UK working in animation and VFX. I've written a report for Animation UK identifying sources of finance for this sector. My personal goal is to get more female characters on screen, but with little funding, national funding from the BFI and BBC in that sector, how do I build those bridges with the finance community for long-term finance and investment in my business and for other SMEs in that sector?
Okay. Pass the microphone there, please. Yeah, I'll come here.
Hi, Cheryl Miller from the Digital Leadership Institute, and I just want to ask Linda, first, thank you so much for all of your brilliance and your hard work on this topic. You're really a shining star for the rest of us. And I'd like to go back in on the digital inclusion question and talk about the stereotypes that are keeping the women from entering these sectors and entering startup, even though we see the numbers. Literally in the efforts that we're carrying out, these women are saying, we feel like we're in a safe space. I mean, the mindset that we have all become conditioned to having, the fact that Michelle Obama says, oh gee, I'm not so good at math. You know, first I want to tell you all to please stop that. I mean, stop apologizing, because I think that's the first issue. But how do we how do we pinpoint that conditioning among women ourselves and get us out of that psychology on this side, along with the changes that have to happen on the other side?
Thank you. If you pass the microphone back, because I've got uh-oh, this is bad. We'll get as many points as I can, and if you're quick, then I'll get lots of points in. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Philippa Lee from Malala Fund. We work on girls' secondary education. And I had a question for members of the coalition as to whether anyone has taken more of a life cycle approach to women's economic empowerment, tying up issues of education with labour market participation. I'd love to hear any examples that you have of that and the impacts that that kind of approach may have. Thank you.
And we may not, if I get everyone's questions in, you may not get answers to everything, but at least we'll get points on the table. Yeah, madam. Yeah. There, and then I'm coming. Okay, yes, you go. You got the microphone.
Quick question from PwC. A lot of women here today in PwC, and we love numbers and are quite good at maths. So that's something I can say for sure. The other thing to note, so thank you for that, because I think we're good. The other thing to note is there are a lot of people in the room, there are a lot of females in the room today, and I think there is a solidarity, and I was talking to Katie Ferguson earlier about how comfortable we feel talking amongst women. But actually, it's about education. And Linda, what do you think about disaggregating education, men, women? Is that the right thing to do?
Great. And pass the microphone right in front of you. No, sorry, in front of you first. Sorry, because this gentleman's been waiting a long time.
Hello, I'm Alan Brimacombe. I'm Professor of Geoinformation at the University of East London. And we've talked about measuring things and the numeracy of women, which is fantastic. And our programs are pretty gender equal in terms of data science. But the cliche is it's a data-driven world, and people need access to the data, but it's not actually. Data doesn't do anything by itself. We're increasingly an algorithm, artificial intelligence-driven world, and that tends to encapsulate the existing biases and is then machine-driven and supposed to be kind of objective. Well, it's not, okay? And so the more women we can have in these areas of algorithms and artificial intelligence, perhaps the less bias we'll get.
Very interesting point. If you pass the microphone straight back, it needs to go backwards there to the two ladies waiting there, please. And I'm coming here for last comments, yeah. In whatever order, whichever. Yeah.
We're both great at maths, I'm sure. So I just actually wanted to pick up on the point from the gentleman at USAID. So I'm one of the CEOs within the WPP group of companies, world's largest marketing and advertising services company. So we've got clients in the room from FMCG and also USAID, where we work on a lot of large-scale behaviour change programs. But I'm potentially unusual in that I started my career in the field of international development, somehow ended up as a business leader in the global communications industry. I'm really aware of the inherent contradictions, and absolutely none of it is part of a conspiracy, but it is deeply systematic. So I'd just like to offer my services on behalf of WPP to be part of any conversation around looking at those things.
Thank you very much. The microphone just in front, lady in front of you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nilofer from Care International, and one of the things I wanted to pick up on was this really important point that we need a cross-sector approach across governments and businesses and NGOs. Any thoughts or advice or examples of the broader civil society movement, so unions or women's movements, and how partnerships can be created across that area too?
Good point. I mean, unions, if you think of the role they played, certainly on mental. Now, there's one last question on this side that I missed. No? Okay. Yes, all right, you've put your hand up, so you get the last go. So I can't do two. I'll stick with this one.
Hi, Ritu Chevron. You know, I've heard we need more women suppliers, entrepreneurs, women in the private sector. How are we going to do it when our time is so taken up by child rearing? How are we going to solve that?
Yeah. So we have the care issue we touched slightly on earlier on. It's not just care of the elderly, it's care of the children. Carry on. Right. We're coming up to 11, but I don't see anyone running for the door. Why don't you take a few of those, and maybe some of your colleagues here as well from the GWBC.
Yeah, let me try to get to the last one about time, and then I would like to hear from some of the GBCW on this, so maybe you can be thinking about this. I know several people have STEM programs and several people have things that they've innovated to get around the mobility issue that came up a few seconds ago, or anything else that you think you want to respond to, but I know those two have answers. Yeah, on the time poverty thing, no matter what sector or aspect of the world economy you look at, the number one reason why women either have less, work less, grow less is the care burden. It is the care burden. And I think that one of the things that might get people to pay attention to this at long last is the fertility bust we're getting ready to see all over the world. Nearly all of the big fertility is in Africa now, not exclusively, but to get into the average 5 or 6 kids over the course of a lifetime, that's where you have to look. In the rest of the world, you're hovering around replacement rate, but in many countries, especially in Europe, you're well below replacement rate, and in some countries, like Germany, for example, you are now past the point, what they call the point of no return, all right, where you get so low on your fertility rate that you can't come back. And that, from what I've seen, the consensus is that what causes this is the unwillingness to accommodate this burden, the unwillingness to say, we got to do about this. Because what happens is when you don't accommodate that, you get low labor participation and low fertility rates, because people have to choose, women have to choose, and the ones that choose to stay home and have babies don't have extra babies for the ones that stayed at work. Okay, and so I mean, I think this really, this really needs. I think it could be a point of reckoning, because social services are going to suffer, consumer markets are going to suffer. I think it's going to be a train wreck.
There's something. Well, I'm going to let you have the very last word. So who should we call on your team? Because I don't know on the union issue, on the digital leadership stereotypes. I mean, there was credit.
A lot of people who are doing STEM stuff, but I also kind of want to say, I know that Mondelez and Marks and Spencer, I think, have been dealing with the mobility issue, like how do you get to the women, or how do the women get to you? Anybody want to talk about any of that? Or Coca-Cola can as well.
Good. No. Any last comment on these points? Yeah. Or
The thing that we look at is how do we reach the women in a safe environment in order to provide the capacity building or the training. And so whether that's in a rural location where we might be going out to farmers and cooperatives, we have used buses to go out there. We've used local areas to actually just train people in safe spaces. Right the way through to going into, favelas in Brazil with local NGOs who can speak the dialect and reach people where they are. I think the most important thing is that you don't go anywhere or encourage the women to go somewhere that is going to be unsafe for them or expensive to get to. And there's lots of creative ways of doing that. All of us are doing that in collaboration with all sorts of interesting partnerships. Which includes, UN Women, it includes the ILO, it includes so many different partnerships, both across private sector, public sector, governments, and other NGOs. So I think there's lots of examples each one of the companies here could give you.
And I've got past 11 o'clock. I'm sorry, and I've taken so many points there. Last point on the unions, and as different sort of partners often don't get these sort of international relations conversations, a word in on this. How important do you think it is, some interaction with different types of groups within the corporate, government, civil society axis? Is it always NGOs, government, private sector? Do you think unions have a role to play in this?
I think they very well might. I think that in general, collective action for women, not even just in labor, is just really extremely important. Yeah. They need to have a voice that's not just one individual, because often they're problems are individualized and thereby ignored. So I know that several of the NGOs, I know Oxfam works a lot with unions.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about CARE. I did want to comment. They were one of the very first NGOs, at least in my reckoning, who got into this private sector partnership and did so in a really pretty good way. And I don't know for sure, but I know some of the NGOs very definitely do.
Right, we've switched the air conditioning on, which will make it quite cold in here soon. So this is a kind of bit like the ringing the bell at the end of the evening at the pub in England. I said it was getting warm, but I know how cold it gets when you switch it on. So we saved it up right for the last 5 minutes. You don't stand around here talking too much afterwards, because I know that'll happen. I will say a big thank you, Linda. Let me just say it's been great to host the Global Business Coalition for Women's Economic Empowerment here. Great to meet all of you. Hope we can do some work together in the future. I think on behalf of my colleague Stefan, Sarah and her team, who put together a great meeting here and our work on gender inclusive growth. It's great to be able to look for partnerships, and we've met, I think, as you will do as well, a great group of people who've come to join us today. Thank you for posing great questions and making great comments and insights. Hopefully we can all remain a bit of a network around this subject. We will certainly keep our work going in this space. Look forward to partnering with you on it. And I think I would note as well, we also are going to be doing some work with, as we said earlier, with the Argentinian presidency of the G20 in this space specifically. I know somebody here who's keeping an eye on it, a colleague of ours who is very much connected with Argentina. So I'm glad he's here as well to hear these comments we've discussed today. So all I'd say is thank you, Linda, for a great report. I read it last night, most of it. Have a look through. Take a copy with you. It's worth it. And it's got nice pictures and it's got boxes. And thank you very much.